Today's daf is daf Kuf Aleph, and we're picking it up where we left off, even though it's the middle of a brisa. But we're talking about pigeon and the possibility of a zevach, an animal that was consecrated as a korban, and then it received a mum. Now it's blemished, and it can't be brought on the mizbeach. Then can we be poda it? And the Gemara is going to differentiate here in this brisa between what's called a mum kavua and a mum over. Yachol yiftu al mum over. Right, so this is a few lines down from the top of Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. Do you think that you could be poder the zevach after it has a mum, but this mum is a mum over, which means it's going to heal? Talmud Lomer, that's why the pasuk says, Asher lo yakrivu mimena karban lashem. And what do we derive from this pasuk? Misha ena krevola kol ikar. The Torah is telling us that the permissibility of pigeon, of redeeming the animal and transferring its kedusha onto another animal, or that might be tmura, so therefore we want to transfer the kedusha onto domim, onto mos. That's only because it's lo yakrivenu. Lo yakrivenu means you cannot bring it on the mizbeach. And that means Misha Ena Krevel Hashem Kol Ikar, which is a mum kavua, that there's no way of healing that blemish. Yotzas Azu She'ena Krev Hayom, but Krevel Amochar. But there's no pigeon for an animal that's a zevach which will be healed, and therefore, even though today it has the blemish and you cannot bring it on the mizbeach, but tomorrow you'll be able to bring it on the mizbeach. So let's go back now and review, so that we could pick up today's daf, the Shita of Shmuel. And Shmuel had a very interesting perspective on the Mishnah with regard to Menachos and Nesachim. And although the Mishnah seems to indicate that with regard to Menachos and Nesachim, even though they contracted Tumah, and that's what's called Tumas Ochlim, but nevertheless, you can differentiate between the following two scenarios. As far as pigeon is concerned, the permissibility of pigeon would only apply if the Nesachim and the Menachos have not yet been placed into a klisharis. And in that situation, once it becomes tameh, then you could be poded. But Shmuel went a step further, and he interpreted the Mishnah that even if they're tahorim, you can still be poded them. And the reason for that, again, is because they haven't yet been put into a klishares, and therefore they only have what's called kedushas domim, which lends itself to pigeon, and not kedushas aguf, which will only be effectuated once you place the menachos and the nesachim into a klishares, but that hasn't happened yet. Mosiv Rav Huna bar Manoach. Let's look at the Sefer of the Mishnah and see if we can understand this Mishnah and reconcile it with Shmuel's principle. The Mishnah says, "Ha'ofos ve'ha'etzim v'alavonu klishares." In all these four cases, shenitmu ein lahem pigeon, shelo nemar pigeon ela bebehema. Now let's try to understand what the Mishnah is establishing. Obviously, these four categories have been sanctified with Kedushas HaGuf, and therefore the Mishnah establishes that there's no pigeon, because Kedushas HaGuf doesn't lend itself to pigeon. Now, the reason why in the case of an oaf, which is on this list, is a little bit different, there's no pigeon. I mean, after all, why shouldn't the oaf be like any zevach that has kedushas haguf, but once it becomes invalid for the mizbeach, for example, it has a mum, then automatically it lends itself to pidyon. And in the case of an ophir, since it was nitma and it contracted tum, it's no longer worthy and valid for the mizbeach, therefore it should lend itself to pidyon. So the Mishnah says, "Shelo nemer pidyon ela bebehema." The only case where something that has kedushas haguf and then becomes disqualified, therefore lends itself to redemption, that's only a behema, but not an oaf. So therefore, Bishleim of the Gemara analyzes the Mishnah, ofos kedushas haguf ninhu, and therefore there's no pidyon even if it becomes disqualified through tuma, because lo nemer, that principle that you can be poda kedushas haguf after it becomes possible, that was only formulated by the Torah el behema, but not be'ofos. But let's look at the other three categories that the Mishnah excludes from pidyon: eitzim, levona, ukle shares, lifriku. These are not kedushas haguf. This is only kedushas damim, and if it's only kedushas damim, then why shouldn't it lend itself to pidyon? And the only way we can understand this is by saying that even in the case where, let's say, any of these three categories of eitzim, levona, and kleisharis were tahar, elav mishum de tahor bi'alma ein niftin, that there's no pidyon when it's tahar, and therefore there cannot be any pidyon when it's tameh. And if that be the case, let's apply that reasoning to the cases of Menachos and Nisachim, where Shmuel says that if they're tahar, you can be po to them. But why should that be any different than these three cases of Eitzim, Levona, and Kleisharis? And that's when the Gemara now makes the equation, Hachinami here too, in the cases of Levona, etc., and Eitzim, Afagav did nitmu kitahorim dami. So it means that we're now equating Tomei and Tahar, and we're saying in both cases is excluded from pidyon. And even though, according to the Torah law, if it's still Tar and it's only got Kedushas Damim, it should lend itself to pidyon. Nevertheless, the Rabbanan said that since it's Tar, we don't want pidyon. So now we are up to Rav Huna bar Manoach, who is the one who raised this question from the Mishnah. And now the question is, what is the halachic logic that dictates that there's no pidyon in these cases of Eitzim, Levona, Kleishares, which were only sanctified with Kedushas Damim? And Rav Huna bar Manoach says the following: the Eitzim Levona lav b'nei uchla ninhu. We have to understand that in the case of Eitzim lemizbeach or Levona, as we said over and over again, for the shtel lechem, or for the menachos, and we're going to say that there's no pidyon, even if they even if they were susceptible and received tumah, because they're considered like tahar. And Rav Huna bar Manoach answers that the reason why we consider them as tar is because chibas hakodesh mashvile leuchla, they can become tameh, despite the fact that there's no shem ochel. They're not edible. You can't eat wood, and you can't eat frankincense, these spices. But there's a brand new halacha called chibas hakodesh, and that principle called chibas hakodesh generates a shem ochel where a shem ochel doesn't exist because it's not edible. Now, this is based on a sugya in Psachim Chav Dalid, based on a pasuk that the Gemara Darshan Seif HaBasar, and that's referring to the eitzim that are used on the Mizbeach and the Levona that treated as ochel due to their kedusha. Because the greater the kedusha, the more it lends itself to tumah. And that concept of kedusha is called chibas hakodesh. So again, we're deriving from a pasuk that which is normally not considered an ochel, therefore could not possibly be makabel tumah, is considered like an ochel because of chibas kodesh. The high level of kedusha exposes it to the vulnerability of being makabel tumah. Then it says here, the eitzim kivmadelo mishpilu hu l'gzirin. Okay, now eitzim could also become a kli. I don't have to introduce chibas kodesh if the eitzim are a kli, but the only way that the eitzim could become a kli and be makabel tuma without chibas kodesh is if we cut them down and make them blocks that could be used to build, as opposed to firewood. Now, with regard to the Mizbeach, there was a separate halacha based on the Gemara in Tzvachim on Daf Samach Beis that the eitzim for the Mizbeach had to be cut into these gzirin. Excuse me. And gzirim are blocks of wood that are 1 amma long and 1 amma wide, and they have to be thick, which is called the thickness of a sa'ah. And that's how you took wood and made it into logs by sawing it down, trimming it properly, making it fit for the Mizbeach. But up until that point, when it's just wood and it hasn't undergone the entire long process of making it into blocks of gzirei eitzim, which will be royal Mizbeach. So right now, you haven't trimmed it and so forth, and therefore it doesn't have the concept of chibas hakodesh, lo miskashri, meaning it's not an ochel, it's not royal mizbeach, and it therefore doesn't have the status of chibas hakodesh. So mimanavshach, it's not makabel tumah. There's no reason for it to makabel tumah. Levona nami, Levona is not makabel tumah because you haven't yet put it into a klisharis. The lo kidshav a klisharis is lo makasra. And once again, it's mimonasha. It's not an ochel, and it hasn't been sanctified and upgraded to the status of kedushas haguf. It's still only kedushas damim. And klisharis nami hoil the islu tahara b'mikvah. Now, what's going on here? Klisharis, insofar as they're kalim, should be makabel tumah. And if they're makabel tumah, they should be subject and lend themselves to pidyon. Why are we considering them as if they were tar? And the answer is hoil the islay tahara b'mikvah. Kalim, once they're makabel tumah, are put into a mikvah. So if that be the case, then since they kalim they makabel tumah, I don't have to come on to, the concept of chibas hakodesh. And yet, and this is going to be the kasha of Rav Huna on Shmuel, they are excluded from pidyon, even though they're tahorim. And that's antithetical to Shmuel. Shmuel made the point that if they're tahorim and there was no kiddush of kiddush saguf, then they lend themselves to pidyon. So again, let's just summarize. In the case of Eitzim, Levona, and Klishares, there's no, whatchamacallit, there's no pigeon because they are tar, and you cannot be poded tar items that are tar. Again, even though it only has Kedushas Damim, and that's against Shmuel. So the Gemara now defends Shmuel. Look, why is it that if they're tar and they haven't yet been sanctified by Kedushas Aguf, they lend themselves to opinion? And the Rabbanan made a separate gzera that excluded pigeon because they're afraid that those items that are rare and we need them for the Mizbeach, if you're going to allow for pigeon, then we're going to lose them. What are you going to do? You're going to redeem them onto Mos, and we don't have the original. We need the original for the Mizbeach. Now, the Gemara is going to ask why wood is not shchiach. It's not common to get wood. I mean, take any tree and cut it down. What's your problem? But Levona already is not common because, it's, you have to mine it, so to speak. You have to find it. And klishares have to undergo a whole process of kiddush. So the Gemara says, okay, I understand. B'shlem levono klishares lo shchichi. Ela eitzim mishkach shchichi. As we said before, you can't tell me that the Rabbanan are making a gzera not to allow pigeon and eitzim because, they're rare. I mean, wood is not rare. There's an abundance of wood. And the Gemara says, eitzim nami kevad yom amar kol eitzim imtzvo tolas posel legabi mizbeach kol shchichi. As soon as you find any sort of worm in the tree, in the bark of the tree, then it's possible. You can't use that wood on the Mizbeach, and therefore it's lo shchiach. If it's lo shchiach and it's uncommon, then we don't want to allow for pigeon. But keep in mind, that's on a D'Rabbanan level. On a Doraisa level, the Torah would allow pigeon because it's only got Kedushas Damim and not yet Kedushas Aguf. Amar Rav Papa. Okay, so now we have to brace ourselves for what I call a Roman numeral number 2 in today's daf, and that's Rav Papa. So Rav Papa is going to reject Shmuel, and the Gemara is going to fight against Rav Papa. Omar Rav Papa. How could it be that Shmuel would make that statement against the Brisa? Ishmael el Shmuel hadasanya. If Shmuel would have only known of this Brisa, then for sure he would have backed down. He would have rescinded. What does it say in the Brisa? Matvis tmimim lebedek habayis. So he took an animal which is tamim and can be used on the mizbeach. And instead of being makdashit lemizbeach with kedushas haguf, he was makdashit lebedek habayis, meaning kedushas damim. What kedushas damim basically means is that's momon hegdish bekinyano. Hegdish owns the property, and now they will, sell it and use the funds for whatever the hegdish needs. And ein podeno son el mizbeach. We're not going to just give him a carte blanche and allow him to be poda an animal that could be a carbon on the Mizbeach simply because he was makdashit to a limited kedusha of kedushas bedek habayis, meaning kedushas domim. We're not going to forego that. Shekol royal Mizbeach and yotzim midei Mizbeach liolam. We need every carbon that's royal Mizbeach, and therefore he was matvis. Tmimim. Tmimim means that they are unblemished and they're royal mizbeach. We're not going to allow him to just go ahead, give him carte blanche, allow him to be poded, and then we won't have this animal from mizbeach. So it's very fascinating what the Gemara is saying now, based on this brisa, is that once you have the lower level of kedusha, namely kedushas damim, we're going to expect of you to go the full length and circle around all the bases and upgrade it to kedushas mizbeach. And therefore, if you're going to be poda it, then the behema goes out lechulin, and there's no opportunity for the mizbeach to get a hold of this animal. V'afagav the kedushas domim, even though at this point all it has is was matvis tmimim lebedik habayis, it only has the limited low level of kedushas domim. Nevertheless, ein niftim holu tahorim heim. Right, they can still be royal mizbeach. The animal is not tomei, and it's tomim, so there's no blemish. And we need animals for the mizbeach. So therefore, ein niftim, we're not going to let him get away with redeeming it. And in any event, we see here that there's no pigeon when they're tahorim. And if we apply this principle to Shmuel in the case of Menachos and Nisachim, then we're going to say that even though they only have the limited low level of Kedushas Damim, meaning Berek HaBayis, nevertheless, we're not going to allow for pigeon, even though they're tahorim, because they're fit for the Mizbeach. Again, when I say fit for the Mizbeach, they haven't yet been sanctified in a Klisharis, but there's no problem in doing so. So we're not going to just, put our hands up in the air and allow him, as I said before, carte blanche, just redeem it. We need this for the Mizbeach. Is Havi Hadarbe. If Shmuel would have known about the existence of this brisa, he certainly would have rescinded his position. That's Rav Papa. So Gemara says, Velohi, forget about Rav Papa. Shmuel knew about this brisa. Velo Hadarba, he didn't rescind his position. Why is that so? Because we have to know what's shchichi and what's not shchichi. Lav amrid hasam kevid lo shchichi lo mifkrei hachinami kevid shvichi mumim de pasi behema dafil bedukim sheba'ayin nami pasi hilkach lo shchichi. Now, why are you comparing nesachim of wine and menachos of grains to these cases of wood, lavona, clay shares, an animal that doesn't have a mum? In all these cases, we got to grab onto this for the sake of the mizbeach, because it's rare to find wood that doesn't have worms in it, and lavona and clay shares. And an animal which could be used for the mizbeach is not so simple, because shchichim mumin. If you check out the animal, you'll find, there's a din of halacha of bedika. You have to have 4 days before you bring the korban. You have to be bodek the animal. Maybe it has a mum, and that's considered shchichi. And not only that, what kind of a mum would exclude and disqualify an animal from mizbech? Even something like bedukim shabayin, he calls it a cataract in the eye. But this has nothing to do with nesachim and menachos of Shmuel. A rabbinic enactment meant to ensure a sufficient supply for the mizbeach. B'doraisa, he says, since these animals did not have physical sanctity, it's only kedushas damim, they can be redeemed. Okay, now we're up to Rav Kahana. Now, from this point and on, the Gemara is going to bring a whole slew of Amoraim that disagree with Shmuel, from this extreme to the other extreme. Whether it's Lakula in being more liberal, allowing for more pigeon, or Lechumra against Shmuel and not allowing pigeon at all. Rav Kahana Omar, Tmeim niftim, Tahorim ein niftim, V'chein Amar Rabbi Oshia. Tahorim ein niftim. So this is against Shmuel, l'chumra. Shmuel allowed pidyon in the case of Menachos and Isachim that were tahorim, whereas Rav Kahana v'chein Rav Oshia, they excluded pidyon in the case of tahorim because of lo shchiach. We need this, so to speak, desperately for the mizbeach. But tmeim niftim. I mean, if it's tamei, so it can't be validated for the mizbeach in any event. So we don't lose anything by allowing pidyon. And again, we're only at the level of kedushas damim. So all this is the first version of Rav Oshia. But now we have version number 2 of Rav Oshia. Omar Rav Oshia fil tahorim niftim. Meaning not only, so now we're going to the other extreme, lakula vis-a-vis Shmuel. Right, Shmuel was only makil allowing for pidyon in the case of tahorim. I'm sorry, in the case of tmeim. Now, according to the second version of Rav Oshia, even if it's tar, and we had that whole svara that it's uncommon and the mizbeach needs it badly, we're not going to allow, the Rabbanan are not going to allow pidyon. No, we're going to allow pidyon. Now we get to Rabbi Elazar. Kulam, right? We're referring to Menachos and the Sachim. Is tmeim niftim tahorim ein niftim, which was the first version of Rav Oshia and the Shita of Rav Kahana. However, what does Rabbi Elazar add here? Chutz me'asiris ha'efa shel minchas chote. We have a special drasha and yalfusa from which we derive that in the case of a minchas chote, with regard to his asiris ha'efa, let's just go over the basics here. We're talking about a minchas chote of a carbon olav yored, meaning he's going to bring a mincha because he's on the lowest financial echelon. And that's called a carbon olav yored for one of 3 sins. Either because they demanded edus for him and he denied it under oath, or number 2, he took a shvius pitui and he said, I won't do this, and he did that, or tumas mikdash v'kadash. So again, if he's wealthy enough, he'll bring either a kizba or a gedi, or if he's a little bit more poor, he brings either shtei torah shnei bnei yona, and if he's desperate, he'll bring a siris ha'efa of fine flour. That's a karva mincha, and that's called minchas chote for any of these 3 sins. Okay, now we get a very complicated drasha. I'll try to do the best I can with the next line here. Sharei Amra Torah mechataso al chataso. So it means that over and over again, the Torah used the word mechataso, with the exception of asir seifa for minchas chote. There the Torah switches its language from mechataso to al chataso. Okay, what's the difference between mechataso? When does that apply? And then in the case of minchas chote al chataso. So, for example, with regard to a regular zevach, whatever carbon it might be, the Torah says mechataso. B'chiper olav hakohen mechataso. Now, in the case of a carbon olav yored, if he's poor but not destitute, he's in that middle level, and he brings Shnei Torah Shnei B'nei Yona, then also the Torah again uses that same phrase mechataso. Now, what does that mechataso indicate? Before we get to al chataso, very complicated. I'm going to try again. Take a deep breath and try the best I can. Mechataso again, this sounds so strange, but mechatoso means the mem at the beginning of the word chatoso, that prefix, means partially and not totally. I guess you translate the letter mem as a prefix as from, but not all. And therefore, mechatoso means that, again, you could have said, I'm just telling you what not to say, that mechatoso is referring to the sin itself, from his sin, which would mean, paradoxically, that he gets a kapara, but only part of the sin. So that's going to be rejected. So that can't be. Kapara is an all or nothing procedure, proposition. Right. So what then does the Torah mean by mechataso? It means part of his karman chatas, not part of his chet, chatato, chito, it would have said, but chatato means his karma. So what does that mean when the Torah is saying that if he can afford it, meaning he's not that low financial level, that his kapara will be achieved with part of his karban chatos. What does that mean? So here's the case. People can be poor, then they become rich, and then they become poor. And there are two critical time period, time minutes, whatever. One is the time of the Hakadasha when he sanctified it, and the other is the time of that Krava when he actually brings the carbon. And it could be a month in between, a day in between, a week, whatever it is. So, he was rich, and therefore he took money, put it in a pocketbook, we'll call it, to buy a kizbah or a gedi, because he's rich, so that's what he has to bring for one of those three sins. Then, when it came to time for krova, he became poor. And at this point, he's up to that second level of shtei torim shnei bnei Yonah, which cost a fraction of a lamb or a sheep or a goat. So now he's going to only have to use part of the funds that he put into his pocketbook and designated for the lamb or the sheep. And what do we do with the rest? So it's very fascinating. The remainder becomes chul, and that's called mechataso. So chataso here is a reference to the money that was designated for his karban chatos. Now let's talk about the opposite scenario. He was poor, and he designated funds for the lowest level. I shouldn't say the lowest level, let's say the middle level, for shtei torim shnei bnei Yonah. Then he became very poor, and he has extra money now because he's only going to buy a mincha. He's very poor. Now we get to this case of the most poor, right, the destitute, and therefore it says mechataso. I'm sorry, it says al chataso instead of mechataso. And the pasuk reads, "V'kiper olav hakohen al chataso." And the question is obvious: why did the Torah change its language from mechataso to al chataso? So in Torah Sheba'al Peh we define that if at the time of his chet he was on that lowest financial level, And therefore he set aside, in this case, flour, asiris ha'ephah, for a minchas chote. Then, when it came time around, he became wealthy. Nice, he was invested in a startup, and now he's making money. They sold it. Now, the money that he used for the flour is no longer sufficient because now he becomes chayiv in bringing a kizba or a gedi, which is much more expensive because now he's affluent. So what do we learn from the pasuk al chatoso? We're going to allow him to be podeh the kemach, the flour that he set aside for his minchas chote of a dal meaning a poor person, and then he gets back a certain sum of money, let's say 10. The lamb is going to cost him 100. Now he's going to dig into his own pocket and make up the difference of 90. And that's called al chatoso. So he's pushing adding money to that which he set aside for a mincha in order to bring the highest level of the korban, meaning a kizbar gedi. So let's now swing around to Rabbi Elazar, and he's saying that as a general rule, tahorim einam niftim, that even though it has only the sanctity level of kedushas damim, nevertheless we won't allow pidyon. And Rabbi Elazar points out that there's one exception to the rule, and that is a sinner who violated one of these three averos of olav yored, and he was poor, and he set aside money for a mincha, or maybe flour for a mincha. We're going to allow him to be podeh it, even though it's tar, in order to facilitate his adding the increment, because now he became wealthy and he's chayiv in a more expensive korban. Vayta. Omer of Oshia. Now we had two Lashonos in Rav Oshia, and after a long analysis that we're about to begin, we're going to come back and prove one of those two versions of Rav Oshia. Omer Rav Oshia, Shamati Pigel b'mincha l'Rabbi Shimon enemitami tumas ochel. Okay, so now we're quoting a Mishnah, and this Mishnah is actually not a Mishnah, but a Tosefta, so it's a little bit confusing to us. So it's really just a Brisa that deals with Tumas Ochlin. Now, once an Ochel is Makabel Tuma, then it could pass on Tuma. If it's not edible, then it cannot contract Tuma, and therefore it cannot convey Tuma, unless you make it into a Kli. So again, if you want to include something in the laws of Tumah V'Tara, it has to be an Ochel. The Brisa now presents a machlokas between the Rabbanan and Reb Shimon about Isurei Hano. Meaning you have something that's really edible. But the Torah says, like Orla, for example, right? You have Peros Ha'ilon or Klaya Kerem. They're perfectly edible. They should be Mekabel Tumah. But Rabbi Shimon's mafkia the shame ochel because it's also no. You can't have any benefit from Orla, just burn it. Same for Klaya Kerem. And we're going to have a long discussion about Basa B'chola. And we're going to try to figure out where does Pigel B'mincha fit into this. right? So the Kohen, when he did the kmitza of the mincha, he had in mind that the shirayim should be eaten chutz l'zmano, and that's called the machshavas pigul. And now, if somebody eats from this mincha, or the shiarya mincha, I should say, then he gets kares. So first, let's go through the Mishnah, which is really, as I said before, brisa, and see the five cases of Isurei No, which according to Reb Shimon do not have a Shem Ochel.